Siveza iqiniso sivuselela ukuthembeka.
Good morning to all of our colleagues out there who are joining us for this, I think, day 3 of a very progressive, very informative, and a very insightful platform that has obviously been established through the partnership between the Media Institute of Southern Africa, that's MISA in Malawi, also the Namibia Media Trust, that's in Namibia, and Deutsche Welle. Obviously, these are the partners that have come up with ensuring that the future of journalism education in Southern Africa has a platform. And the theme for this year is telling the truth, restoring trust. I'm Patrick Sam, and I've been hosting this with my co-host, Nina Katangana. For those of you who don't know, Salma Moses is also joining us as our sign language interpreter to make sure that this discussion is inclusive this morning. Well, I said it, the launch of the handbook is here. Our dignitaries from our esteemed institutions are waiting. Let's turn it over to the platform. Zoe Titus is waiting for you on the other side of this video.
Threats to African media freedom and free expression have become extremely complex. Before the arrival of online media, the threats were mainly aimed at African journalists and at print, radio and TV outlets. Today, the threats come in so many additional forms. We see internet shutdowns, blocking of online content, fake social media postings, taxes on bloggers, and many more harmful practices. If you're someone who wants to play a role in fostering democratic media policy and practice in Africa, you need to have a very sophisticated toolkit.
Once again, thank you for joining us this morning on this final day of our Future of Journalism Education in Southern Africa conference. And for this particular session, the long-awaited launch of the NMT's e-handbook titled Teaching Media Policy in Africa, a handbook for educators, as mentioned earlier. I'm Zoe Titus, the director of the Namibia Media Trust. Welcome. This handbook is the culmination of 5 years of work by top African media policy experts who helped to deliver a massive open online course on media policy in Africa, hosted currently on the WITS edX platform. It is the content of this MOOC that has now been reworked into this resource for educators to make it more accessible and to influence the content of education curricula. The handbook, as well as the MOOC that I referred to that inspired it, is in honor of Jeanette Minnie, a friend and former colleague, a renowned media activist who helped shape media policy in Southern Africa. She passed in 2016, so a particularly warm welcome to her husband, Pierre Minnie, who is also online this morning. Welcome, Pierre. We are all aware, I think, that journalism and media education is facing a number of challenges. One is that of creating a broad understanding of the media ecosystem, and that needs to be underpinned by solid policy. Therefore, this idea developed to create this resource. While some principles and practices of media policy are covered in journalism qualifications to different degrees, normally under a media law module, the full breadth of these policies in the international context and how the freedoms can be curtailed is seldom covered. So this handbook is designed specifically to provide a holistic view with associated case studies and examples from the African context. But before we continue, please allow me the opportunity to say a big thank you to UNESCO's International Programme for the Development of Communication, IPDC, for its generous support for this project, and in particular, Dr. Sandra Roberts, the lead author, who has worked painstakingly for months to help us realize this goal. Also to Face Media Africa, who has assisted us to include a module on access to information in this resource. Thank you. We have limited time, so please allow me now to introduce our illustrious panel of speakers who have so graciously agreed to share their expertise on media policy. In no particular order, Professor Tawana Kupe, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Welcome. Professor Guy Berger, UNESCO's Director for Strategies and Policies in the field of communication and information. Guy is joining us from Paris this morning. He's taking a break from the general conference that is going on. Dr. Sandra Roberts, researcher and academic head of Frey College, and Mr. Alamin Yusuf, advisor for communication and information at UNESCO's Regional Office for Southern Africa. He's joining us from Harare. Allow me now to hand the floor to Sandra for a brief overview of the handbook. Sandra?
Yes, welcome. Thanks so much, Zoe. I'm just going to talk a bit through the content of the book. The book is called Teaching Media Policy in Africa, a Handbook for Educators. It is inspired, as Zoe mentioned, by Jeanette Minnie, who made history in influencing freedom of expression and press freedom policy in Southern Africa. Through this handbook, we hope to make media educators and journalists aware of media policy and enable civil society to continue the work she started. This handbook is an outgrowth, as Zoe mentioned, of a massive online open course we launched in 2018. And the content of this book is based partly on that and has had a lot of input from various top media policy experts on Africa. So I probably don't need to tell you all that media policy is crucial to a strong media that can keep governments and other players accountable and build free, pluralistic and independent African media. But there is this need to sustain bottom-up policy contributions so that the media can serve people. And our media policy environment is becoming quite complex. So we put together this handbook to support existing journalism and media studies curricula in institutions already, but also as a standalone curriculum on the media policy for institutions. So in this way, we're hoping that the online content that has been just phenomenal is available to far more people without technological restrictions. So as part of this handbook, there's some supplementary materials. There's guides for individual modules for learners. There's case studies that come from the original course on civil society action in different countries. We've opted to put them online because they can date. So by putting them online, we can make sure that educators have access to the latest case studies. And there's also analytic articles on the impact of COVID on various media policy issues. The handbook is divided into 7 modules, together with an introduction that provides guidelines to educators on how to run this course, both online and offline. I'm going to walk through the different modules, highlighting some points of interest as we go. I mean, the content of the book. The book is 150 pages long, so it's got quite a lot of meat to it, and it's got quite a lot of different issues that it goes through under the various topics. But overall, it takes participants from the very basics of freedom of expression and media freedom through the various aspects of international and national law to how to make policy changes in terms of media policy through advocacy. Each module is split so that it can be held in two parts, as two different lessons. Okay, so module 1 walks educators and learners through the basics of media policy and freedom of expression, together with their contributions to sustainable development on the one hand, the Agenda 2030 goals, and democracy. So internationally, this is expressed through civil society declarations and international covenants, and I love this this timeline, because it really gives you an overall of how media policy has developed and how civil society declarations have been part of international developments. The module also explains how international policy can be translated into national law, as well as the hierarchy of law on national level, with of course the constitution being paramount, and then statutory and case or common law, which is interpretations of statutory law. Module 2 turns to the ideal policy environment. This is structured around the UNESCO FISH model, which stands for freedom of the media, independence, safety of journalists, and the degree of pluralism and diversity. And to this gender, of course, is a key element to add, both in terms of the representation of women in content and in newsroom staff and management. It then discusses the 3 tiers of media: the public, the private, and the community, as well as factors that encourage the development and independence of these tiers, which leads us quite neatly into media policy and content diversity. For this handbook, media pluralism refers to a diversity of owners and controllers of media, while media content diversity refers to the type of content that is available to people. Content on a range of subjects can meet their needs and is in line with their interests. Like in all sections, this model also refers to online media and the power of digital media, and also the ability of states to clamp down on online media. Then module 4 begins looking at more detail at media regulation and its role in democracy. It discusses what can be regulated, which is media content, media structure, and media behavior. So content is, for instance, news programming in broadcast licensing conditions, structure, who's allowed to own what, what cross-ownership of media is allowed, and behavior such as the professional conduct of media professionals. It also looks at different types of regulation: statutory regulation, self-regulation, and co-regulatory systems. It, of course, also looks at the degree of independence of these regulatory bodies. Then Module 5 actually refers to the right of access to information and democracy. This module is a new addition to the content from the online course, and talks about the importance and principles of access to information. Right of access to information is critical, of course, to fighting corruption, allowing for participation in government, accountability, ensuring economic development, and protection of human rights. The principles discussed in terms of what is a good environment for right to information law is presumption in favor of access, what information can be legitimately withheld from the public, proactive disclosure, disclosing before requests, having information publicly available, making people aware of the right to information, and making it easy to access information, as well as the right to appeal decisions when information is not made available. Then with Module 6, we circle back to the role of civil society in policy making, and particularly how civil society can push for better law through regional and international bodies, as well as how civil society can improve the law through giving input. Then we get a bit more practical for Module 7, and we look at actual advocacy campaigns. There's a lot of generic guides on doing advocacy campaigns. So what we've looked at is more of a helicopter view of advocacy strategy with particular reference to campaigns. And we also have a section there on how to analyze law with a view to predicting the kind of impacts that it will have. Throughout the guide, which I must give some credit to my colleague Fiona Peake, she has, it's beautiful. It includes further readings and resources. It has formative assessments, and through the formative assessments, because it's an African-wide guide, it allows learners to apply the lessons to their context. It also includes summative assessments in the form of assignments, which require that application to a particular context. Also throughout, again, the handbook ensures that media policy relates to the digital environment and makes sure that the policy addresses the real modern environment. I'd just like to add my voice to Zoe's and thank everybody who made contributions to this book. And please, we'll share a link. Ensure that you fill in the form to get a digital copy, and you'll be able to get the more materials from the Namibian Media Trust website. Thanks so much. Back to you, Zoe.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Please note the link to the handbook. We've placed it in the chat box. It's ready for download from the NMT's website. Note that this is a work in progress. We will continue updating the information. That's a nice thing about it being online. We will constantly update it with additional case studies, more information on COVID-19 and particularly its impact on the media. So please come back to our website frequently for updates. We'll also post updates on social media so that you know what the developments are. So let's get right into it. We have about 20 minutes for possibly 2 rounds of questions and closing remarks, after which I'll open the floor for questions and comments from our audience. Guy, let me start with you. Fostering democratic media and practice in Africa requires a very sophisticated toolkit. How is the IPDC supporting that? And in particular, how do you see this handbook contributing to that toolkit?
Thank you, Zoe, and congratulations to NMT for leading this and for reaching this point. This is super. If I can just make a few initial remarks. First of all, Zoe, you mentioned Jeanette Minnie, who I think will be known to a number of people, and Jeanette was the inspiration, I understand, for this initiative. And I knew Jeanette Minnie, and one thing that she taught me was that there's policy, and then there is an absence of policy. And when a country does not have a policy, that is a policy. It's a policy not to have a policy. And then she also taught me that having good policy is one thing, implementation is another thing. And these are really important insights, I think, into understanding this, especially for journalism educators or political science educators or anybody who's even just wanting to self-educate. Because now I speak with my former hat. I used to be head of the Journalism and Media Studies School at Rhodes University in South Africa for 15 years. And really, it became very clear to me that much as many students, they just want to learn the craft, they want to learn how to do journalism. Actually, they also needed to understand the policy environment or the no policy environment or the failure of implementation of policy, because this is what they were going to work in. And they couldn't just think they were going in somehow autonomous and independent of this environment. In fact, often they would go in and then find that they needed to be part of changing and improving that environment. So if this handbook had been around when I was a journalism teacher, I would have found this really useful to give to students, to integrate into my courses, maybe even to run a specialized course on this. I want to say now about IPDC, which you also kindly mentioned. So IPDC is a committee of member states at UNESCO, and 39 member states. And I serve as the secretary to this committee. And they entertain proposals for projects, and they agree to support. So this project proposal came from the Namibia Media Trust, and these member states said, oh, this looks like an interesting thing. And then they voted a small grant to do this. And that's the kind of thing they do, amongst other things. So the IPDC, this committee also generated the United Nations Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists. It's also developed a lot of indicators. And right now it's also promoting an initiative to support media viability, which is such a big issue. In terms of your question about democratic practice, let me quickly say something here, that if we go back to where you sit, Zoe and Namibia Media Trust, 1991, I'm sure people know or should know, and students need to know, 1991 was the Windhoek Declaration. They're adopted by journalists in the capital of then independent Namibia. And that was very interesting because that really influenced policy. And particularly it focused initially on the print media, the Windhoek 1991, to have free, pluralistic, independent media. That's where we get the slogan from, which was from the Windhoek Declaration. Actually, in the background here, you can see That was the poster that I have in my office from the original Windhoek. So it started with print policy, free, pluralistic, independence, and then it went on 10 years later. The anniversary focused on broadcast policy. That was the 3 tiers that Sandra mentioned. And then also subsequently, 20 years on, it was access to information. So these are all policy areas that were really driven by commemorations of civil society that had such an impact on setting the norms, not only for governments in Southern Africa and other parts of Africa, but at UNESCO also. This was really influential and affected funding and programs and so on. And then I just want to reference that this year in Namibia was the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration. And I'll send the link here. The Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration added to all these things. So it keeps all those earlier norms about media policy, but it added the need for viability, the need for internet transparency, and the need for audiences to be media and information literacy. So in a nutshell, you can see that the Windhoek Plus 30, it also brings in the online environment. So you start with print 30 years ago, you go to broadcasting, you then go to access to information for the broader society, then you come to the online, which is now. And that's the relevance of this new declaration. And there's so many new policy questions that do face particularly media actors in Southern Africa. So I'll post a link to this Windhoek Plus 30, but I also want to tell you that Thursday this week, the member states at UNESCO will be debating if they will recognize this Windhoek Plus 30 declaration. The original Windhoek Declaration gave rise to the World Press Freedom Day, 3 May every year. So that was very influential in that regard. Now we have this Windhoek Plus 30, which actually the UN General Assembly in New York is referencing in a new resolution on safety of journalists. So the question is, will UNESCO member states, 193 member states, will they respect and recognize the power of this declaration that sets guidelines for what kind of environment we need for media and journalism in this digital age?
Thank you very much.
Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. And you've actually set the scene for my question to Tawana. The focus of media policy has shifted over the past 2 decades from socio-political concerns to technological and economic concerns, focusing now more on people's access to infrastructure, to markets and products. In your view, what would be the 3 priority areas that require action that you would wish to bring to the attention of educators, students, policymakers, and civil society activists?
Thank you, Zoe, and yeah, good morning, everyone. Well, I'm assuming everybody's in the morning. There could be people watching from anywhere around the world. So good afternoon and good evening. No, I just like to put one throwaway comment here is that policy is too important to be left to policymakers. And that's one of the things that, if you like, journalism, I might be jumping to answering my second question, but I think you will see why it's important in answering this first one. The one thing that journalism still faces a challenge is in how to make policy actually interesting to the generality of the public and civil society, and connect it with people, what people will consider their real issues. So policy is still very much an abstract thing. And having taught policy a little bit when I was really a practicing academic, and now I'm trying to write a book on media policy reform actors since the late 80s. The thing I constantly see is that in journalism, we're not able to engage with policy, even media policy and regulation, let alone make policy interesting to our audiences. Now, the second point I want to make in relation to your question is that I see that there has been a shift, but the shift is somewhat unfortunate because all of these things are interconnected, if you like. If you are talking about an African context, it is not wise to be leaving public service broadcasting institutions out and the socio-political concerns, because in policy lies within the socio-political domain anyway. I think, but you're quite right that the shift or the priorities appear to have moved elsewhere. I want us to connect the dots, if you like. So for example, the 3 priorities I'll put up and then come back to my point is actually that the potential of the digital technologies, the rapidly developing digital technologies, to give greater access where the infrastructure is available. Remember, we are the continent of the digital divide, a vast digital divide, including here in South Africa, for example. We saw it in higher education, not directly media. We saw it in higher education when the pandemic hit. 20 out of 26 public universities in South Africa, only 10 could finish the academic year in 2020. And the reason was very simple: lack of access to digital teaching and learning platforms. And that's replicated, of course, when it comes to digital platforms to the media. So digital access and access to infrastructure and how it's funded and how it's accessible to particularly poorer communities to access rich information and not just receive WhatsApps with loads of fake news and fake videos is an area that's very important. And now that's a huge political, economic, and social. What are the policymakers doing about access to digital infrastructure for public information and communication? Second one, of course, is that where there is access to digital platforms, that diversity of content that is empowering to publics is very, very important. I just alluded now to the fact that on the face of it, a lot of people are now connected, right? But we really mean people on smartphones, sometimes accessing tidbits of information, and the large majority of it is not democratically empowering. It won't give you information to participate in public policy making, which is what we want to do. And larger numbers of people participating in public policy making is actually how democracy ought to work, isn't it? It's how you can hold accountable the policy makers. So again, I'm looping back to the idea that policy has been somewhat privatized, and it is too important to be left to policy makers. And the third thing is also for me is lack of a better word, and I've repeated myself in webinars in the last 24 months since the pandemic around this issue. We need some degree of, I don't know how you do this, best guy as an idea, how you actually, in a sense, institute what I call a program of digital information and media literacy. Because let's admit it, most people don't understand how the media actually works. And also the media is not the kind of institution that tells you how it works. It tells you that it's actually important to you, and it is, but it doesn't tell you how it actually works. What are the inner limitations as well as the outward limitations? But the media is the platform by which the public can participate in policy making, because essentially, I mean, you do not have a community-oriented forums that actually are widespread enough to reach the common person on the ground. So that, if you like, would be my input on this one.
Thank you very much. We have a number of former lecturers on the panel, so I really feel as if I'm being schooled this morning. Alamin, if I may direct the next question to you, how would you describe the state of journalism education in Southern Africa at this moment? And what criteria and indicators do the IPDC use to assess the quality of journalism? And importantly, how was monitored?
Thank you so much, Zoe. Journalism training in Southern Africa is offered by a wide range of establishments, from universities to colleges, non-profit organizations, even the NGOs. For instance, we've seen MISA being involved in so many initiatives in relation to journalism training. And in the area of in-service journalism training, we even have international government organizations such as UNESCO, IMS, which also contribute. So you can see that journalism training in the region is offered by a wide range of establishments. But now, looking at the training capacities and available equipment, the situation is a little bit dire. I think Professor here just talked about the challenges when it comes to reliable internet and digital infrastructure. But even in situations where some of these journalism training institutes are well connected, the students themselves are not well connected, especially in the current situation, COVID situation, where many of these journalism training institutes had to resort to using online platform for training. So they have obsolete equipment, and this is all because of budgetary reasons and other resources. For instance, many journalism students can no longer afford to publish student newspapers, but also in the area of national, international support and cooperation. Unfortunately, the media itself is very fragmented in the region. And this is also somehow reflected in the journalism training. In the past, used to have Highway Africa, for instance, which was a very interesting platform, which brought together journalism training institute, which is no longer there. In fact, yesterday when I was preparing myself for this session, I was also looking at the UNESCO chairs and the UNESCO Unitary Network program. And unfortunately, looking at our region, we only have one university, which is the University of Limpopo, which has a UNESCO chair. So you can see there are very limited opportunities for international support and collaboration. And in the area of gender equality, the trend is that increasingly we are having more women registering in journalism, mass communication studies, and even public relations. I think one of the reports, for instance, by Alan Finlay, just an example, for instance, I think Rhodes University has up to 60% women registered. So that's the situation in terms of gender equality. But there are also a few challenges in the area of placements when you're talking of internships, where it's not easy to place students. In the media, which is now laying off staff, it's not even easy to absorb students coming from the universities. And of course, talking of linguistic diversity, Africa is a continent which is very linguistic diverse. And unfortunately, most of the journalism institutes cannot offer or accommodate teaching journalism in local languages, especially for local journalists. Now, talking about the criteria, maybe I will refer to the criteria which were highlighted in the UNESCO Journalism Centers of Excellence. And they are divided into three main criteria. The first one is curriculum and institutional capacity. The second one is professional public service, external links and recognition. And the third criterion is development plan, strategy, and potential. Maybe let me highlight very briefly about the different criteria. For instance, when you talk of curriculum, you're looking at the balance between theory and practical training, teaching resources and equipment, the percentage of enrolled students who end up graduating, what kind of internet access is available, digital tools, etc. You're also looking at systems, for instance, continuous assessments. Does the university have continuous assessment, etc. On the second criterion, we are talking of professional and public service and external links and recognition. Here you're looking at how the school interacts and relates to the industry. For instance, do they have external examiners? Do they have consultations on their curriculum? Or do they have assessment on internship, etc.? And in the area of international networking and recognition, you're looking at the level of involvement of the school in journalism and training networks and associations. You're also looking at whether the school serves in the different editorial boards or involved in external evaluations of other programs and vice versa, etc. And also, you also look at publications and web presence of the institution. And the challenge now, as I said earlier, in Africa, many of the institutes are not well established. The websites are not properly updated. You find many of the lecturers don't even have proper email accounts. They use Google, they use Who emails, etc. And finally, looking at the development strategy and potential, you're looking at the momentum of expansion of the improvement of this school's program, and also their innovation and ability to adapt to challenges and opportunities. And the big one, of course, is do they have a written annual or medium-term strategy?
Yeah.
So these are some of the criteria which I looked at. Now, in terms of we also have budget and sustainability, which I've already mentioned earlier. It's a challenge, and also the approaches that the management chooses, whether it's more in the participatory approach, etc. Now, how is the criteria monitored? Unfortunately, I think you refer to IPDC. I'm not sure if I understood your question very well. Maybe let me refer to what my director said. IPDC is a committee of member states. Unfortunately, IPDC doesn't have any monitoring or accreditation mandates. So these criteria are left to the journalism training institutes to monitor themselves on voluntary basis. And maybe this is a subject for further discussion on how this criteria can be monitored further. So that's my contribution for now. Thank you so much, Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alamin. We have very little time left, so I'm going to ask you to please keep your responses very brief so that we can fit in the second round of questions, because we really would want to hear from you. So Guy, back to you. Journalism education is inextricably linked to the economic viability of media organizations. This has been a recurring theme during our conference, actually, over the last 2 weeks. I am aware that the IPDC has dedicated over 40 years to supporting independent media through training, through research, capacity building, support to law reform, etc. How might the IPDC help reinvent media development, especially the challenge of economic viability? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Zoe. The IPDC, this committee of these member states, has actually become quite concerned with this because, of course, from a government point of view, if media continue to downsize, even close, if no new media can be developed, I mean, this is a problem for governments, especially in the context of disinformation and social messaging that's even off the radar, but is distributing a lot of hate and disinformation. So I think they recognize that something needs to be done to support media. And of course, as we know, media are really struggling, particularly during the pandemic, but it's also a longer term thing because so much communication and advertising is shifted away from media, and even media to reach the public has to go through a gatekeeper, and these gatekeepers give no special treatment to media. They give special treatment to the amplification of emotional content that's really designed to polarize and keep people glued to screens, or to entertainment, which is fine. But the problem is that the world also needs information, not only entertainment. So this is why this committee is concerned. So what can they do? They have commissioned a range of research to assess the problems. So shortly there will be by UNESCO a study, global study, including of particularly 10 countries, of viability being done by Economist Intelligence Unit. And then there is shortly a handbook of good practices by media actors about how they've managed to raise money or change the law to get some kind of tax breaks or some kind of sponsorship for health reporters or municipal reporters and so on. And then they've also, they have supported the development of a policy paper. And this policy paper will come out next year. And one of the key recommendations that will come with the UNESCO sort of blessing is that countries need to actually put together a national task team or commission of inquiry, some kind of way of bringing together media, advertising industry, public relations industry, marketing industry, economics industry, small business startup industry, all this kind of stuff, and donors, see what can be done at national level, because the solution's got to become change at policy, which we've been talking about, but not just national policy of the internet companies, because like in Australia, maybe they should be compelled to share or pay for some content, and then policy in the newsrooms, policy in the media institutions. So this will come out next year from IPDC. The last thing I just want to say is that IPDC also got some money from Google and Google News Initiative. So in the next couple of weeks, there'll be a call for developing a new concept of excellence in journalism schools around Africa. And coming out of that, there'll be some grants to journalism schools to become more excellent. And becoming more excellent, I think today it's got to include, how do journalism schools contribute to this issue of viability? Because there's no point in educating young people to go into non-existent communications careers.
Indeed. Thank you, Guy. Thank you. Tawana, I'm sure you're familiar with the Afrobarometer, a Pan-African research index. Well, it's also featured on the first day of our conference. Now, the Afrobarometer concludes that democracy and freedom are generally in decline in Africa. How, in your view, might informed engagement in African media policy and practice potentially reverse this trend?
Thank you, Zoe. Afrobarometer, I recently signed a partnership with Afrobarometer, which will run summer schools and related courses. I mean, of course, the decline in freedom and democracy in Africa one has to ask the question, what has been the role of the media in that particular kind of decline? I think quite a lot of media in Africa since the late 80s, in fact, were one of the drivers and key agents of what we call democratization, if you like. And also part of that, as you remember, MISA was a key player in that all the way from to the Windhoek Declaration, was that actually to grow editorially independent and media that enjoy editorial freedom and to pluralize media, right? So there was a growth of media outlets on the continent. Now, as Guy just said, now there's a decline of media on the continent. I'll also add something as fragmentation of media on the continent. And also this fragmentation is also ironically represented by the emergence of the so-called social media, which in a sense, as Guy said, are not necessarily engaged in substantive information dissemination that strengthens democracy. Now, of course, all of those things are policy decisions. Growing media or shrinking media is a policy decision by various stakeholders, right? And so media ought to actually make this explicit, that the democracy and freedom that you say declined was on the back of a growth of a media system, is pluralization and its diversity. Now, if it is in decline, look here, what is also in decline is the very same said media. Now, I think that there's something good that's come out of social media as well. I'm not condemning all of social media. There is some social media used by civil society organizations, including even individuals, that have expanded freedoms and freedom of expression, right? Now, the policy, the media ought to then, if you like, make explicit which forms of media expand our freedoms and freedom of expression and enable us to build better, more sustainable societies, and which kind of media do not, and what are the democratic forms of regulating that kind of media. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, media policy making and regulation is too important to be left to policymakers, because actually it is the instrument by which the public, in a sense, also hold media accountable, but grow a media system in the interest of ensuring democracy does not decline, but flourishes.
Okay, thank you, Tawana, thank you for that. And you're reinforcing what Guy just said, but you also reminding me of something that, I recall Jeanette saying, something to the effect that establishing and sustaining independent media is not like selling shoe polish. And that was at the time when, this is what, more than 20 years ago, when the issue of the sustainability and support to independent media was already a critical issue for us on the continent. Alamin, finally, would you shed some light on UNESCO's News Lab Teaching Fellow Program and how that benefits journalists in Southern Africa? Very brief.
Yes, yes. I mean, let me compliment what my director, Guy, said. Actually, it's part of IPDC's action to support excellence in journalism training in Africa. And it's expected to benefit more than 100 journalism institutes throughout Africa. And target is to reach more than 4,000 media professionals in the continent. And the background, of course, is what we are discussing at the moment, the impact of internet platforms on media viability, but also the changing news consumption in Africa, especially in Africa, where you're talking of approximately 40% or more citizens who are aged 15 years or younger, and almost 60% under the age of 25. And this, we assume, are very technologically savvy, citizens. So the media really needs to adapt to this new changing environment. And so through the News Lab Teaching Fellow, there will be grants. So there will be application for grants, call for grants, and the winning grants will receive funding for support in their local initiatives when it comes to promoting excellence in journalism training. The good thing is we have a champion of this initiative, my director, Guy Berger. So maybe he can further comment on this. But in a nutshell, that is what is all about the News Lab Teaching Fellow program. Thank you.
Siveza iqiniso, sivuselela ukuthembeka.